Okay, I'm going to jump right in. I am going to share my screen a lot of the time, take a break some of the time, and per usual, for those of you who have studied with me, try and take a break and elicit 2 or 3 questions or reflections in between sections. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen now. So I just have to find the share screen button. Okay, please bear with me for a moment here. Make sure I have the right one that I'm sharing. I have a lot open. Okay, I think this is correct. Okay, looks correct to me. I want to start by pointing out where we are in the book of Exodus, in the book of Shemot. I've just started to adapt my own personal Shemot outline documents. You can see I started a column for Torah portions and just put in today. So the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. They were delivered, redeemed, freed by God and Moses. They've begun the march toward Sinai. And here we are in Parashat Yitro, the Torah portion of Yitro. Today, we are going to focus on chapter 19, which is the beginning of the revelation, God revealing God's self to the Israelites. It's worth noting, many of you, I know there's a lot of knowledgeable people on this call. It's worth noting that chapter 18, from a leadership perspective, from a relational perspective, from a family dynamics perspective, chapter 18 contains Yitro and his advice to Moshe about delegating. Yitro is Moshe's father-in-law. And if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating. We are not going to focus on that today, nor are we going to focus on the actual 10 commandments or 10 debrot statements, utterances, in chapter 20, Perek Chaf. Today, and if you have not yet explored those, I highly encourage you to do so. We are going to focus on what I think is one of the most fascinating and most difficult chapters in the Hebrew Bible, the chapter of Revelation, the beginning of Revelation in chapter 19. So I'm going to switch here, and I'll make this a little, well, I'm going to keep this the size as is, and I hope people can see well and can pull up their own docs if the document that Julie shared. And I always say at the beginning also, in this PDF that you received, my email is at the bottom, and if you don't get to share a question or reflection, please feel free to do so after the class. Some people here know I'm fairly quick to respond, but I always say, please give me a few days. So I'd like for us to read together some of text 1. It's a long doc here, but we're not going to read all of it together out loud. And I even put a note in there to remind myself of where I wanted to read from. So we are going to jump in. Actually, I think we are going to start up here just to situate ourselves at Mount Sinai along with our ancestors, and begin with a pause in the journey of the Israelites, and then we'll jump in, and I want us to pay attention to verses 4, 5, and 6 and think together about, well, what's going on in those verses before we jump to the heavy-duty revelation. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading, and then I'll invite one of you to read shortly. So, and I'm going to read in English, but the Hebrew is here for you too. So chapter 19, verse 1, our Torah portion, Parashat Yitro. On the 3rd new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day they entered into the wilderness of Sinai. Having journeyed from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. Israel encamped there at the front of the mountain. And Moses went up to God. God called to him from the mountain, saying, "This is what you should say to the house of Jacob and declare to the children of Israel. I'm going to read a little bit more now. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings, famous image, and brought you to me. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession. And here I'm going to point out the Hebrew, sigula. You should be my treasured possession among the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be a kingdom of priests, mamlachet kohanim, and a holy nation, goy kadosh. These in and of themselves are all very difficult concepts, and we could spend one session on each of them. I'm going to wrap up here, and we're just going to think about the big picture of these verses. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel. So what we have so far is the Israelites camping out at the mountain, at Mount Sinai, and then we have these introductory verses before the thunder, the lightning, the shofar, the trembling of the mountain, before God speaks, before Moses speaks on God's behalf, before the climax, as Julie said, of the revelation, we have these verses. I want to think with you for a moment. What is the significance of these verses? Could we not have jumped right in with verse 7, and which we'll see in a moment, and the beginning of the revelation? What I just mentioned, the thunder, the lightning, all the sound effects, the sci-fi, as one of my friends recently said. So what is the significance of verses 4, 5, and 6 without necessarily jumping in on the specifics of what it means to be a treasured possession or a holy nation or a kingdom of priests? Why these verses here before the effects of revelation? So I'm curious to hear what a few of you have to say. And I see a hand, I'll call on the person. So I see Esther Westelman raising her hand. So I'll ask you to unmute and share your thoughts. Why these verses? Why this content?
I like the expression on Kanfei Nesharim, on the wings of the eagle, that the eagle more than any other birds carries the people on the top and protects them. And to me, this is a beautiful image that God presents to us.
Protection. Okay, beautiful. Thank you, Esther. What other thoughts do you all have? A couple of you. I'll take two more on why these verses in particular before the climax of Revelation, before the debrot, the commandments, before the sound effects.
Lois?
Well, they were slaves in Egypt, and they still had a slave mentality. And so reviewing this is to allow the Israelites to sort of change from being slaves until being a community, community of Jews. And so they're explaining to the Israelites what it means to be a Jew, and that we are a community now.
Okay, so Lois, thank you. I want to know, Lois, I am going to take one more reflection. In what words or phrases do you see the allusion to community? Where do you see that in the words? If possible. If you don't, it's okay.
On verse 6, it says, "But you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." These are the words you shall speak to the children of Israel.
Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna get back to that. I want to take only one more, unfortunately, so that we can keep covering so much material here. So I see Jennifer, who's made her way to the top of my screen with her raised hand. So Jennifer, what do you see here as perhaps the purpose of these verses before we dive in?
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I wanted to say, one other angle on these verses might be that when the Israelites were slaves, nobody asked them to go into a kind of contract. Nobody asked their opinion. It was just, you're going to do this and you have no say. But I'm looking at the if you will obey me, I'm actually giving you a say in this.
Great. Okay, fantastic. So Jennifer and Lois, I'm going to take what you said in particular and really expand on that. I do think what we have here is a relational model, meaning God doesn't just jump into revelation. God articulates very specifically, we are now in a relationship. And going back to what Lois said about a slave mentality, it's true, the Israelites, and let's talk about Israelites here rather than Israelis or Jews. I just like to be very specific. The Jews did not exist until the Second Temple period, at least, and Israelis are modern citizens of the state of Israel. So I always like to mention those things in particular because it can be confusing. So the Israelites are in the process of forming a relationship with God. God could have just jumped in with revelation, but if we want to share some big news with someone, or if we want to approach a massive a hurdle in a relationship that we're trying to address, or something, as I started to say, very positive, we have to think first about the relationship, the effect on the other person. There's perhaps here, in my interpretation, a lesson in communication. Rather than scary sound effects, giving over of the law, I think Jennifer mentioned covenant. Rather than right away entering into a covenant, we see the relationship forming between God and the Israelites. And one could say, oh, well, God has been perhaps impacting the Israelites since they were slaves in Egypt. Moses was trying to get the Israelites out of Egypt, the Hebrews out of Egypt, another term. Right now, we see the beginning of this covenant, the beginning of the relationship. So I think you've hit on so far what's going on here before the revelation itself. And I want to come back to this in a little bit after we read some more text with Abraham Joshua Heschel and a passage from him with a focus on the relationship aspect of this revelation. And I want to think about the relevance of that for our own lives. So we are going to keep shifting into another aspect here of our text in our Torah portion. I would like to invite someone to read out loud, beginning with verse 13 through verse 19. So someone who hasn't yet spoken, and there are so many of you. I see Nishant, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes.
Okay, great. So would you like to read? I'm in
Sure.
English? Okay, thank you
Sure.
so much.
Sure. Reading from Exodus chapter 19 and verse 13. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be either stoned or shot, beast or man, he shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain. Moses came down from the mountain to the people and warned the people to stay pure, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. On the third day, as morning dawned, there was a thunder and lightning and a dense cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud blast of the horn, and all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God.
Okay, let me scroll down so you can keep reading through verse 19.
And they took their places at the foot of the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai was in all smoke, for the Lord had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and stop here. I want to mention here, the beginning of verse 13 is a little bit confusing because it references anyone who approaches the mountain is not supposed to do so and will be killed and will die. So a very strong statement there, I know. I wanted to start with verse 13 because that's where the real sound effects start. There are rules provided to the priests and the people prior to that. I want to share also that chapter 19 is considered one of the most difficult chapters in the book of the Torah, given that it seems like there are several sources, original sources, that were weaved into one. So almost different aspects of the same story by perhaps different biblical authors or editors. So it is very confusing. There are multiple things going on, weaved together in a sort of chronology of events that doesn't make 100% sense. So if you are confused reading chapter 19 on your own, know that you're not the only one. People have been struggling with this for thousands of years. I want us to keep in mind at this moment what I shared with you about the relationship being developed between God and the people, God declaring the specialness of the people entering into a covenant with God, and how the people experience God here. These are some of the most baffling verses to me in the whole Torah. And I want us to think about what they might mean, what the symbolism might mean to you, and how the commentators see this over the years. So I'm going to invite a few comments, 2 reflections on what these verses and the symbolism, or if you see this as more literal, how you understand these verses. And then I'll share with you Rashi and Ebenezer and Maimonides, their brief comments on Revelation, just an aspect, think together about what that all. Elicit 2 reflections from people who have not yet shared yet, since there are so many of us on the call. Let's get some other voices in. Some new.
We have a hand from Maxine and Stephen.
Thank you, Jen.
So I think this is consistent with what was said before about relationship. For me, each has a part to play in this relationship. We have a part to play, and God will play his part. To me, the whole Torah is about this relationship. This is what you must do, and then this is what I will do. And so I do believe, based also on the Torah, how people keep forgetting and complaining and not following God's orders or wishes or rules, or that there needs to be some drama here to get by it. The same way it was crossing the Red Sea, it was very dramatic, it was movie worthy, and this too. People are terrified. They're worried to go along with God, but they're really confused and terrified. It's very human because of where they've been and where they're going. They don't quite trust it yet. And so I think this is to get more buy-in. That's my opinion.
Okay. Thank you. And I think, Julie, you called on Stephen, perhaps?
Yes, Stephen, go ahead.
Actually, my comment was relating to an earlier sentence in this parsha.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, when they spoke about, I will make you a kingdom of priests. Isn't there the understanding that the only tribe that went with him across the Red Sea were the Levites anyhow?
Not in my understanding. All the tribes went through the Red Sea, and in fact, there's even a midrash. I can't remember if I heard this or saw it this week. There's even a midrash about how all the 12 tribes went forth in their own sections, and I seem to remember something about hearing that there was some kind of partition between each of the tribes. I don't recall the specifics. I don't remember if I read it or heard it from someone else, but yeah, all the Israelites, all the tribes. The story is that all the tribes went forth. Yeah. Okay. So let's keep going, and let's look at just a snippet of Ebenezer and Rashi, and then, as you can see, we're going to spend a bit more time on Maimonides, and I think I'll make that Maimonides text bigger. These are very difficult verses, and I wish I could and I think maybe one day I will do a whole class on this chapter and the symbolism of these particular events. Maxine mentioned the drama here in order to get buy-in. I like that idea. I think at the same time, that God's drama never works throughout the whole Torah. There's sin and punishment, and the people are never satisfied. And if we think about the people as a traumatized people from slavery and then being taken out and crossing the Red Sea, these are people that are just at a loss almost, and both God and Moses don't know what to do with them, but the harsh measures, including the drama here, I think it just doesn't work for them. It never works. They're never won over fully. So that said, let's see what Ebenezer and Rashi say about certain aspects of the symbolism. So can I have a reader for texts 1a and 1b? I see Cindy.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so text 1a is thunder, literally voices, a very loud blast of the horn. Again, the word voice is used, but this sound was a miraculous, not a natural one. And text.
And then we'll go ahead.
Okay, text 1b Rashi. A kiln or furnace was simply to give people an image they could comprehend. We use these images to picture God in terms we can understand.
Okay, great. So it seems to me here that both Rashi and Ebenezer and many other commentators struggle, as I am right now with you. What is going on in these texts? What happened? What do the Israelites imagine happened? What was their experience? And how, I'll leave it at that. Ebenezer actually, who's usually not always, I would say I was surprised at this Ebenezer. I didn't imagine that he would actually say, oh, but it was just a miracle. It wasn't, I thought he would maybe try and understand a little bit more from a rationalist perspective, from a perspective of reason, a little bit more like Maimonides, as we'll see, what was going on here. But in this particular snippet, he says, okay, there were voices. The thunder was actually a voice, and the loud blast of the shofar, also some kind of voice. So he is trying to understand it a little bit more in less extreme terms. But in the end, he says this was a miracle. And then Rashi tries to understand the fire, the furnace, as an image in order to help us and the Israelites understand what was going on. Did it actually happen? Did they see a fire? It's not so clear what Rashi is saying. And in this case, although actually I'll have to double check a couple of other places, I didn't see Rashi quoting an earlier commentary, though he might very well have been. But both of these speak to, I think, a struggle with trying to understand what was going on. And the ultimate, and there is some symbolism here in order to help us understand what seems like a divine experience in very human terms. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. The ultimate text, I think, or one of the ultimate texts on seeing the Sinai experience as symbolic, as really some kind of rationalist experience that we don't know about, that isn't so clear from the surface of the text. That idea is exemplified in Maimonides, the ultimate Jewish philosophical rationalist who took on the Aristotelian philosophy approach to philosophy and tried to understand all of Torah in more rationalist terms, and consistently talked about the symbolism and the I can never say this word very well, incorporeal nature of God without a body. It is impossible to have a God with a body, and every time we see that in the Torah, it has to be symbolic. So I'll go ahead and read text 2, Maimonides, and then we'll begin to put this all together. So Rambam in Hebrew says, I shall now go back in order to complete what we began to explain, and I shall say, because of the hindrances that were a stumbling block to the leaders, just note that on your copies, of the children of Israel and their apprehension. Their actions too were troubled because of the corruption of their apprehension. They inclined toward things of the body because of our own, let's say our own cognitive limitations. We have to understand God as having a body, but our whole passage, Rambam's, Maimonides' whole passage above, is to show that whenever words like seeing, vision, and looking occur in this sense of God, in the context of God, intellectual apprehension is meant, and not the eye's sight, as God, may he be exalted, is not in existence. I think I'll check I typed that up, so I have to check that. I apologize. An existence that can be apprehended with the eyes. So God is not a sensory experience, despite this very clear sensory experience as the biblical authors relate to us. God is actually an intellectual experience, and if we can't comprehend cognitively what happens at Sinai, the easiest thing for us to do is to see the symbolism. It doesn't necessarily solve our problem of what happened there, but Rambam, I think, is encouraging us to say, you know what? Try and understand this intellectually, or understand that you can't understand it. So I'm curious to hear what people's reactions are. We'll take 2 to 3 reflections or questions now that we've read Ebenezer, Rashi, and Maimonides, and trying to, who are all, I think, struggling with what happened at Sinai, and maybe give us a starting point, just a starting point, to struggle and to explore our own understanding of what happened. So I'm curious to hear from you a few reflections or questions on these texts.
We have a hand from Sheila, which may have been from before, and Cheryl. So Sheila, did you have a question or comment?
No, well, I actually had put my hand up to read, but I'm wondering why. Do we know if God is male? Like someone said, we refer to God as he. Somehow
Yeah.
I've always thought that God as a he, but that's just my personal conception. Like we say, blessed
Yeah,
be he. To
exactly.
me, someone said, why is God always talked about as he? I
Sure.
thought God was genderless.
Yeah,
But
I
thought,
appreciate your question.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead. Do you want to finish?
I just thought, to me, I just think of God as kind of a father figure. And to me,
Yeah.
father figure as a male.
Okay, thank you, Sheila.
That's
I'm actually going to stop the share for a moment just so we can focus on the conversation. Stop share. Okay. Okay, Sheila, thank you. And I didn't, sometimes I do mention this at the beginning of a session. I think ideally, certainly in 2022, it is ideal for us to talk about God as God without a he or a she. I know lots of people who in their teaching make every effort to, and I think have gotten used to some extent, saying God said rather than he said, and some people even do throw in a she. You might also want to throw in a they, but God in the Torah certainly is depicted as a he. There are a few passages in Isaiah. I know there's one in Isaiah. God is sometimes depicted as a mother rather than as a father, nursing the Israelites. But traditionally over thousands of years, Judaism has seen, Jewish texts and Jewish figures have seen God as male, while also figures like Maimonides talk about God as without a body and therefore without a gender. So, it's a challenging situation. It's a challenge in 2022 to think about how you describe God. So I appreciate your bringing into the conversation here that really ideally we should be speaking of God as genderless, but it is hard to do that, especially if you were raised with speaking about God in the male pronoun. So I invite you to do what's comfortable for you. And when I teach, this is a space where you can do that. Whatever is comfortable for you, whatever feels right to you, you can use whichever pronoun, he, she, they, or you can speak about God as God. And I'll ask you to forgive me if I say something that doesn't quite sit 110% with you. So additional reflections or questions on Maimonides, Rashi, Ebenezer, and the text, the Sinai revelation, the beginning of the Sinai revelation with all the sound effects. And I want to share with everyone, I really don't see the comments during our time together. I'm focused on you and the text. So if there is something you really want me to see, I would ask you to take the extra step and email me if you're so inclined. Okay, so other questions or reflections?
Yeah, we have Cheryl and then Jan and Betsy.
Thank you.
I have a couple of things. The first one is with even Ezra, with the use of the Hebrew term kol for thunder, for the thunder and the shofar. And that's something that I had noticed before, and I'm glad that you brought the even Ezra mentioning that, because I found that really interesting, that that's the word that's used and that it's translated as thunder, and then it's translated as shofar.
Great, so you find that helpful, the Ibn Ezra?
Yeah, I found it interesting that even Ezra is thinking like me.
Okay, yeah, it's always comforting to see that. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Cheryl.
But
do you want to say something else?
But also, when we read the Maimonides, I was thinking, he's talking about God is not physical, which is interesting that, besides just this section right here where it talks about these physical manifestations of God, throughout the entire journey, we have the columns of smoke and fire.
Yeah, okay.
Of God.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, that's a fantastic, I'm glad you mentioned that God is portrayed as guiding the Israelites through the desert as a pillar of cloud during the day and as a pillar of fire during the night. So Cheryl, thank you. And that's also something I wish I could spend a whole class on or semester on. Okay, one more reflection or question on Maimonides, Ibn Ezra, Rashi, and the verses on Revelation.
Okay, it looks like Jan may have stepped away for a moment, so we'll go to Betsy's iPhone.
Hi, I just love this whole image, and if you want, we just had this week the eruption of the volcano in Tonga, and if you can go on YouTube, you can hear the booming, you can see the eruption, you can see the tsunami, you can feel awe and fear and empathy for the people, and you can imagine yourself being at Mount Sinai. I mean, it's just so cool. It's all happening this week.
Betsy, thank you so much. There is writing on what may have happened at Sinai, being the revelation experience being connected to a natural disaster or a natural event that occurred at the time. So I'm so glad Betsy mentioned that. And Betsy, thank you. I will certainly go to YouTube afterwards. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you brought that in. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to begin to conclude our time together today with a Heschel text. So I have to find my right screen here. Why don't I see it? Okay, bear with me for a moment. I'm not sharing. Oh. Okay. Okay, I think I've successfully shared. All right, can I make this a little bigger? So we're going to shift to Heschel, and I'll ask someone to read Heschel for us. I think John Messer is raising a hand. Is that right? John, if you are, you can unmute. If not, we'll ask. Oh, there we go. Oh, no. Okay, would anyone else like to raise their hand? And oh, Bimaya. I know Bimaya. Hi, Bimaya.
Hi. Good morning, Rabbi. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Okay,
Good.
so we've got
Thank you.
God in Search of Man here, Abraham Joshua Heschel. Revelation does not happen when God is alone. The two classical terms for the moment at Sinai are Matan Torah and Kabbalat Torah, the giving of Torah and the acceptance of Torah. It was both an event in the life of God and an event in the life of man. According to rabbinic legend, the Lord approached every tribe and nation and offered them the Torah before he gave it to Israel. The wonder of Israel's acceptance was as decisive as the wonder of God's expression. God was alone in the world until Israel became engaged to him. At Sinai, God revealed his word, and Israel revealed the power to respond. Without the power to respond, without the fact that there was a people willing to accept, to hear the divine command, Sinai would have been impossible. For Sinai consisted both a divine proclamation and a human perception. It was a moment in which God was not alone.
Hey, Bimaya, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I find this interesting because I was doing a study yesterday and it talked about, we were in Genesis and it was talking about God creating light and separating light from darkness, but then like the heavenly bodies not being made till day 4 and the light creation and separation was day 1. And I'm like, well, then where was the light coming from if God himself is light? Like, wouldn't the light have already been there, right? Like I didn't understand like how it's created. And when I think about this, this ties into that in the way that it seems like his presence was here, but the light couldn't come until it's like his attention is focused on something. And that something having been us, it allows the relationship to blossom into something that's as magnificent and ongoing as it is today.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Bimaya. It's really beautiful. I want to build on what you're saying about the effect of God on humans and bring us back to the text that we started with and then back to Heschel. So I'm going to scroll up briefly. I asked at the beginning what is necessary about these verses 4, 5, and 6 that begin this dramatic revelation. And I wrote here, what would you title the section? I'm going to offer a few possibilities, but I invite you to think about some possibilities in your minds also. Building a relationship, beginning with a relationship, God and Israel, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, a special nation. The focus here before God shows God's self is on the other, is on the person, the people, the humans in front of them. And whatever is going on here in this revelation, which is very difficult and rich with symbolism and perhaps rich for our spiritual lives, I think in the end, at least where I'm at today, is this forces me in a good way. This really invites me strongly to think about my relationships, whatever is going on for me that I think is important, that I want to share, or whatever is going on for the other person. We're not islands unto ourselves. And I think it's the hardest thing to do because, especially for those of us that are passionate about text study or whatever it is, we can never forget, and we really have to, for me, I really need to give myself a reminder, and the Torah here helps me do this, that there's always someone in front of me. And I have a friend who grew up very religious, and forgive the terminology for now, but she talks about the word avoda in that Ashkenazic kind of expression. In other words, avodah, service, work. And I feel that my avoda, and maybe the avoda that we all have, is not only to focus on what could be a rich intellectual experience, a rich spiritual experience, but a rich interpersonal experience. And the fact that these verses are at the beginning here invite us to do that. So I invite you to continue to explore these texts from a spiritual perspective, an intellectual perspective, and also from an interpersonal perspective. And for us all to always keep in mind that no matter what is going on that we consider important, there's always another person in front of us, either figuratively or literally in front of us in an important conversation. So with that, I will wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and once again, invite you to continue to exploration on this week's Torah portion and all the ones that follow. And also at this moment, I'd like to invite 2 or 3 reflections or questions to round out our time together today. And I'll stop the share also.
Thanks, Abby. We have a hand from Marian. Marian,
I was volunteering to read, that's all.
oh, okay.
Oh,
Next time. Anyone else have a final comment or question? Go ahead, Barry.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask Rabbi, you bring up avodah, and the way that I was trained is that we have to watch out that sometimes avodah can become misdirected, and a little bit later we have avodah zara. So I wonder what your personal guidelines are in terms of making sure that our avodah activities are properly directed.
gosh, that's a huge, that's a very weighty question. I think, I mean, to some extent, I think we each have to know ourselves best, meaning better than anyone else knows us, and we have to work to stay grounded and focus our kavanah, our intention, our efforts, our avodah, our service, our work in ways that are meaningful and grounded, rather than in ways where we may veer off, that are in ways that aren't productive to us or to other people. It's such a deep personal level of self-awareness that you know, hopefully we all work toward. And I think that question is different for that answer is different for everyone, but I think it's a great question to ask ourselves. How do we direct our intention, our work, our service? And are there times when we do get off track, because we are human after all, where we can bring ourselves back? But I think that answer is different for everyone. Thank you for bringing that in.